Our group project is on Chapter 3, Constructionist Theories. I'm doing my outline on labeling theory. Basically, labeling theory is a form of symbolic interaction, a version of symbolic interaction. They basically, in the book, divided into two central ideas: interaction for one, and symbolic is the other. Basically, they define interaction as a collective action involving more than one person's act. In terms of labeling theory, it is important not to focus on the deviant person alone, but rather on the interaction between the supposed deviant and the other. So basically describing, don't worry about who's the person committing it, look at the fact of how is this going on, how is it interacting, how is this deviant person imposing the act within whatever is going on societally or whoever he's doing it around or towards. Unlike the positive perspective of focusing primarily on the deviant itself, the new labeling approach now looks at the bigger picture. Those who have or have said to comment on a deviant act and not comment, commit a deviant act, and the rest of society. Each group complements each other. Without a deviant society, we wouldn't be able to distinguish what's acceptable or viewed as a non-deviant and what's deviant. And they basically break down symbolic as the interaction between the supposed deviant and the conformist is governed by the meanings they impute each other's actions and reactions. The people attached to the deviant act is more important than the act itself. So whoever commits the act, why do they commit it? What was their form of committing it? What was their reason? Is more important than what they actually did itself. Labeling theorists' meaning is determined on how people respond to the act. So once this act is done, how does society see it, and what is the repercussions or what came from this act being done? There's a negative response means deviance, positive response means non-deviant. So basically, if this person's reaction to the deviant is like a negative reaction, he's probably a deviant person. If the reaction is a positive response, then he's probably a good person. He conforms to societal means of what's deviant and what's non-deviant. Kitsu explains forms of the behavior per se do not differentiate deviance from non-deviance. It's the responses of the conventional conforming members of society who identify and interpret behavior as deviant, which sociologically transforms persons into deviant. So basically, how you perceive deviance or what is deviance will be determined as deviant based on your society. I just put a little quote here. It doesn't look at the deviant individual who committed the act, but rather looks at the impact it has on the regular individual. What is his or her response to the act committed? So how did he take it? How do they respond to it? This little side note, labeling theorists interpret deviance as a dynamic process of symbolic interaction between both the deviants and the non-deviants. My next subline is who labels who. People who represent the forces of law and order as well as conventional morality. So basically police, judges, guards, psychiatrists, social control agents, anyone of a higher power is basically what determines who's being deviant. They're able to label you as that. They're able to basically put their title on you as a deviant. So if you're a criminal, you're basically a deviant in terms of police and things of that nature. Becker, 1974, says a major element in every aspect of the drama of deviance is the imposition of definitions of situation, acts, and people by those powerful enough to legitimated to do so. Basically, it's easier to target the lower class. They say lower class people are supposedly more deviant. A little subsection of that, consequences for labeling. So these are once you are labeling someone a deviant, consequences can be both for the labeled and the labeler. We're going to start with the labeled. One consequence is that once the individual is labeled as a deviant, he will be more likely to over time see him as a deviant. once after this occurs, you then are more likely to commit another deviant act. These acts, once you are multi-committed, are either start as a primary deviant act or a secondary act. The primary act can be valued conflict, basically meaning he didn't realize or know he was committing a deviant act based on society. The secondary act is applied when the deviant understands and comes to terms with society and then again does another act. Uh, this is what then labeling theorists are more interested in because they want to understand why did this person redo it once society has helped him understand, or once he came to terms that it wasn't right, what made him recommit another act. Secondary deviance examples, I put ex-con. Society plants a dark cloud over an ex-con. Hard to find work. Be successful and refit back into society, so it's hard for him to re-engage, readjust, assimilate within societal terms once he's been in jail. It then forces him to obviously or odd times commit another crime. Now we're going to consequences of the labeler. This is more of a positive consequence. Labeling a person deviant creates a positive consequence. Once the consequence isn't, it then also enhances social order. So basically, once you let people know that that's not right, or you label someone as you shouldn't do that, it pretty much conflicts or conforms other people to follow your path. Um, an example of this is individuals who are periodically singled out as criminals. Conventional people would then know better the distinction between good and evil, so they can themselves, because then they can ally themselves with good against the evil, so then they can conform with the group instead of going with the people committing the crime and adding to the issues and everything else. Overall, our last sublet is evaluating labeling theory. It's taken a lot of criticism, although some studies show or repeat offensive secondary deviance, many don't. Um, there's criticism towards it not showing how the initial act started. So why did this person do it in the first place? Or why did they even commit the act? It also takes criticism it doesn't really deal with hidden deviances. So basically, you can't label somebody that you don't know is not committing it. So people of authority, if they're being deviant, um, no one really knows because it doesn't come to terms often, and that becomes an issue within this labeling theory perspective because how does society know to distinguish or come to terms with people who commit things? So when we hear about judges or we hear about priests or we hear about people committing these things, it's kind of more of a shock than an average person doing it, and it's hard to deal with sometimes because the powerful people are the ones that label the deviants. That is my overall outline of my section in chapter 3, the constructionist theorist, which is chapter 3, and my subsection was labeling theory. Thank you.
The phenomenological theory is a spin-off off the labeling theory and was created in the late 1960s. And what the phenomenological theory does is it basically looks at a person's subjectivity to themselves. And, you know, the example given in the book was suicide, and how suicide should only be considered suicide if there's intent of death, and it's hard to tell that intent of death after that person's dead. You know, you can't step in that person's shoes and know that they intentionally did this. You don't know if it was accidental overdose. You don't know if it was an accident. It has to be proven intent to be considered a suicide, and that's where you really have to get in the mind of these people and understand what caused them to do these acts. And some of the examples that were given to us were Harold Garfunkel, which was a therapist that worked with a 19-year-old who was born with male genitalia but had female secondary sex organs and considered herself as a female. And he had to go through intensive therapy with her before he could sign off that she could get a sex change. And he explained how in his studies with her that she saw herself as normal. She did not see herself as a freak. And he related it back to deviance, how these people who commit these crimes, they don't see what they're doing as wrong, or they don't see what they're doing as out of the norm. That's normal for them. So it's hard to, label them as something that they don't even realize. And then another person that was introduced in this section was Jack Katz, who explained that murders and robbers, although they understand deviance, there's some positive light to the acts that they do. they feel superior to their victims, that I could kill this person or I could rob this person, therefore I am the stronger link, and that is what phenomenological looks at. How these people who commit crimes or commit deviance, do they realize that they're deviant? Do they understand the repercussions, or do they understand, or do they really just think that these things are okay? Like, because deviance is very relative. So if you think that something's wrong, someone else might not. And that's what phenomenological looks at. And the term that we're introduced to is endography, which is the application of phenomenalism, which is applying each section to the phenomenon that happened, and to not generalize, and to just really understand the thought process that brought on this act. And, phenomenologicals have offered a very convincing argument about the inadequacy of positivism and the blanks and the holes that it has in that theory.
In Chapter 3, it also talks about the social reality theory, coined by Richard Quinney's 1975 conflict theory of criminality, which is also known as the social reality of crime. Richard Quinney blamed unjust law on the capitalist system and believed that criminal law is used by the rich and powerful to keep the capitalist system and the rules going. 4 factors produce the capitalist society's high crime rates and to keep the dominant class strong. 1. With whatever threatens its interest is defined as criminal act and is defined by the rich. 2. Applying those laws to protect their interests, so the rich assign police officers, judges, etc. to protect these laws and detain anyone who goes against them. 3. The lower class is compelled to do these acts that are defined as criminal by the upper class due to their poor living conditions. And 4. The upper class uses these acts as the basis for constructing and diffusing the ideology of crime. Example, believing the poor contain most of the criminals due to them needing to act upon these crimes because of their living conditions. These 4 factors play a part in keeping the capitalist system crime rates high. Later on, Quinney called for action and believed there is something wrong with society. Because the powerful oppressing the powerless, he called for a revolutionary consciousness, ending the oppression of the lower class and create democratic socialist society.
Hello guys, Chapter 3, Constructionist Theories. I was assigned conflict theory and legal reality theory. So by definition, conflict theory is a theory propounded by Karl Marx that claims society is in a state of perpetual conflict. Due to the competition for limited resources, it holds that social order is maintained by domination and power rather than consensus and conformity. Conflict theory was brought up a long time ago, but more than 70 years ago, a group of sociologists began to point out the pluralistic, heterogeneous, and conflict nature of modern society. It states that those who live in a simple traditional society tend to share the same values and culture, therefore leading to a harmonious relationship with one another. Conflict theory is brought up with 2 subgroups, social conflict and cultural conflict. Social conflict is said to do with incompatible interests and desires of such diverse groups. Examples, liberals versus politicals, whites versus blacks, and etc. These groups exert social power to attain scarce or incompatible goals and prevent the opponent from attaining them. Cultural conflict must do with the discrepant norms and values that derive from right and wrong. It is considered what is right in one culture is wrong in another. Let's jump into legal reality. So legal reality is brought up 2 subgroups as well. One is law in the books and the other is law in action. Law in the books states that authorities ought to be fair just by treating everyone equal, and law in action shows that legal authorities are treating citizens unequal. Thus, they favor the rich and powerful over the poor and weak. People blame laws on how they were constructed and who they favor those in power, thus changing the modern Anglo-American system through time. The government then used force and coercion as the means of handling wrongs and disputes. They created legislative, judiciary, and appointing judges to settle disputes between states and individual citizens and individual citizens themselves. Within time, vagrant laws are still changing to protect the rich rather than the poor. It's said that government seeks to maximize reward and minimize the trouble for the government. Law enforcing officials rather prosecute powerless people who can't defend themselves rather than the middle upper class citizens. since it could cause trouble for their organization. Therefore, the law serves an interest for the rich and the powerful. Examples: a celebrity gets caught with illegal substance or a gun, he will not go to jail. In contrast, a powerless person caught with either one will get prosecuted because they can't defend themselves. That'll be all for Chapter 3, Constructionist Theories and Social Conflict, Conflict Theory, and Legal Reality. Good guys.
The Marxism theory looks at the cause of deviance, specifically tied to capitalism, and how capitalism will lead people to commit crime. Not only are low income people committing robbery and theft, and higher income people or corporate people are committing embezzlement, not necessarily embezzlement or actual crimes, but deviant acts going against morals, such as fixing prices, dividing up the market, eliminating competitors, doing backhanded things to make their way up, because it is known that in that world you kind of need to be heartless. You need to step on people's backs, and that's what this theory looks at. And it goes so much past just crimes that are directly linked to economic means, but due to the stress and you know pressure that it puts on people that can't provide a regular day-to-day life, they can tie rape, murder, assault, alcoholism. They can tie all these things into the stress that monetary has on people. And as Sheila Baker, Ronna Berger, and Jeanette Smith in 1980 explained, marginalism leads to lack of self-esteem and a sense of powerlessness and alienation, which creates intense pressure on individuals. And that pressure gets released in deviant acts. And, they say that crime is only committed for two reasons, which is for emotional reasons or it's for economic reasons. And that's what Marxism looks at. It looks at the economic reasons and the economic causes of why people become deviant. And it's so much more than just crimes linked purely with money. It can also lead to so many other branches. Almost every crime could be linked to monetary, and that's what they look at. And, capitalism affects everyone, even when you're rich. People who are rich want to be richer, so they do what they need to do to get there. And people who are poor want to make a means of living, so they do what they need to do just to make it day by day.
Chapter 3, Feminist Theory. Female theorists disagree with the assumption that theories apply to both men and women. They argue that the extent theories of deviance are only about men. In other words, some theories may be valid for male behavior, but not for female behavior. The Merton's anomic strain theory. The theory assumes that people are prone to strive for material success. Assumption may be true for men, but not so much for women, based on the influence of patriarchal society. Therefore, women most often are more interested in attaining emotional fulfillment through close personal relations rather than achieve material success. This theory assumes that in which case women do have a strong desire to have material success, but do not have the opportunity to do so, they will as likely as men to commit crime in the same situation. But in today's society, women are becoming more ambitious in achieving the material success as men. Even with lack of opportunities, the reality is that they are not as likely as men to engage in deviant activities. Relevancy of women in theories. Women lack relevancy in theories due to the male bias, failure to take women into consideration. On the other hand, feminists focus on women in theories but often emphasize on gender, which in turn becomes just as important to the study of men. Addressed by female theorists, women as victims of rape, sexual harassment that reflected upon the patriarchal society. They also touch base on women as offenders that argue that although the crime rate for women have risen, the increase is not big enough to be significant. The criminal opportunities for women are much less available to women than they are to men. They are more likely to commit minor property crimes such as shoplifting, willful fraud, credit card fraud, and passing bad checks. Little increase of women involved in more profitable crimes such as burglary, robbery, and business fraud. Increase in feminist poverty. Most women criminals are employed without a high school diploma and single mothers with small children. More likely than women in the general population to be victims of sexual and physical abuse while growing up. They also barely fit the image of liberated women who are prone from little increase of gender equality.
Focusing on the power theory, It is said that power can be an important cause of deviance because having power or the lack of power determines the type of deviance people are more likely to carry out. Power inequality affects the quality of people's lives. For example, the rich and powerful live a better life than the poor and the powerless. Power inequality also affects the quality of deviant activities likely to be engaged in by people. The powerful are more likely to engage in profitable deviant acts such as corporate crimes, while the powerless are more likely to engage in less profitable deviant deeds like armed robbery. So there are 3 reasons why the powerful are more likely to commit profitable deviances than the powerless to commit less profitable deviances. For one, the powerful have a stronger deviant motivation, which comes from a relative deprivation. And 2, the powerful enjoy greater deviant opportunities. So a rich banker enjoys more legitimate opportunities than a poor worker to make money. And 3, the powerful are subjected to weaker social control. So the powerful have more influence in the making of laws and like the law enforcement. So when they're committing crimes, their consequences are more like lenient, and seldom they don't get into as much trouble as you would if you were less powerful. So basically, the more power you have, then the more seldom your consequences are, the more you can get away with deviant acts, the more freedom to do things.
The postmodernist theory was first brought up in the earliest 20th century as a philosophical movement in France, and this movement actually influenced the arts and social sciences in the United States in the 1960s. And it basically just took the modernist theory and added a spin on it. It said the modernist theory lacked innovation, rationality, objectivity, and it just lacked modern science and technology. They also argued that modernist theorists were putting their personal beliefs and their personal biases into understanding a subject of deviance. So, what postmodernists study is an act of destructivism, where they take an event of deviance and they break it down and they want to expose how it got built, how it got to where it was. And the example that the book used was government and protesters. Protesters aren't necessarily doing something morally deviant, but they are going against the grain or going against a norm or the superior that is the government. So therefore, they're trying to understand, why are these protesters upset? What is the cause of it? What made them want to protest? So it's basically understanding and really breaking something apart and understanding the root of the problem. Another term that was introduced in the postmodernist theory was linguistic domination, which assumes that the conflict exists in any social interaction. So any person, any interaction, any relationship has this one superiority over the other. And that's what they were looking at. And when that superiority is questioned or people go against it, that's what most postmodernism tries to look at. Why? What caused it?
The section that I'm covering is in Chapter 3, page 50, Critical and Conflict Theories. These theories help in understanding how social inequalities such as capitalism and patriarchy influence the making and enforcing of norms, rules, or laws, or the definition, production, and treatment of deviance in society. Conflict theory is used for explaining the motivations behind the formulation of laws, such as for why the powerful bother passing laws against sex, gambling, drinking, and loitering. These don't seem to threaten their powerful position in society. Sociologists point out that the modern society is pluralistic, diverse, and full of conflicts. Social conflict involves incompatible interests, needs, and desires of diverse groups, while cultural conflict deals with discrepant norms and values regarding right and wrong. Both social conflict and cultural conflict lead to criminality as an inherent, normal, and integral part of modern society, as studied by conflict theorists. Today's conflict sociologists are less interested in causes of deviance and more interested in how one becomes defined as criminal. So conflict theory challenges the underlying values of capitalism, such as sobriety, individual responsibility, deferred gratification, industriousness, and the belief that true pleasures in life can preserve capitalist values and capitalist system, and hence the dominant position of the powerful.